She came to clean his house, but what she found behind the locked door changed everything. A silent maid, a grieving sheriff, a room filled with secrets that weren't what they seemed. She thought she was running from her past, but instead, she discovered a man trapped in his own. Sometimes the darkest secrets aren't about crimes. They're about hearts too broken to heal. What would you do if you held someone's deepest pain in your hands? Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that will touch your soul. Subscribe for more emotional journeys, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. This is a story about second chances, silent understanding, and the courage to trust again. Maria's fingers trembled against the brass doorknob, worn smooth by countless hands before hers. The September wind carried the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke, wrapping around her thin frame like an unwelcome embrace. She had traveled 300 miles to reach this place, this small town that promised anonymity, a place where her past couldn't follow, where the weight of whispered accusations couldn't reach. The house stood before her like a monument to order. White clapboard siding pristine as fresh snow, shutters painted the color of deep forest shadows. Sheriff Carter's residence commanded respect, even in silence, its windows reflecting the amber light of late afternoon like watchful eyes. Maria pulled her worn shawl tighter, the fabric soft from years of washing, and pressed her shoulders back. "You must be the new help." The voice came from behind, gravelly and measured. Maria turned to find Sheriff Carter himself, his uniform crisp despite the day's heat, badge catching sunlight like a small star. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale, distant, unreadable. "Yes, sir." Maria Santos. Her voice emerged barely above a whisper, accented with the cadence of her grandmother's lullabies. He studied her for a moment that stretched like taffy, taking in her downcast gaze, her calloused hands folded against her stomach. "Mrs. Henderson spoke well of your references. You'll find everything you need inside. I keep simple hours." Maria nodded, watching as he climbed into his patrol car and drove away, gravel crunching beneath the tires like broken promises. She stood alone in the settling dust, holding a single brass key that felt heavier than it should. The house exhaled as she opened the front door, releasing the scent of lemon oil and something else, something older, sadder. The interior spoke of a man who lived carefully, each piece of furniture placed with military precision. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, their silver frames catching light like small mirrors, but the faces within seemed frozen, distant. In the kitchen, Maria found a handwritten note propped against a ceramic sugar bowl. Clean thoroughly. "Do not disturb the upstairs study. Meal simple. C." The handwriting slanted sharply to the right, each letter formed with deliberate control. She traced the words with her fingertip, feeling the indentations left by his pen. This would be her world now. These rooms, these routines, this careful dance around a man she didn't know, but whose life she would tend like a secret garden. As twilight painted the windows purple, Maria unpacked her few belongings in the small servant's room behind the kitchen. She hung her mother's rosary on a nail beside the bed, its wooden beads worn smooth by decades of prayers. The tiny crucifix caught the last light of day, casting a shadow like a blessing against the plain white wall. 3 weeks passed like water through cupped hands. Maria learned the house's breathing patterns, the way the floorboards sighed. In the morning, how the pipes hummed their lonely songs. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, polishing surfaces until they gleamed, arranging Sheriff Carter's life into perfect order. He spoke little, offering only necessary words delivered in that same measured tone. "Coffee stronger tomorrow. Iron the uniform first. Thank you." Each interaction felt carefully rationed, as if words were precious things he couldn't afford to waste. Maria watched him through peripheral vision, noting how he paused sometimes at the base of the stairs, hand resting on the banister as if considering something on the floor above. The upstairs study remained forbidden territory, its door perpetually closed, a brass lock gleaming like a warning. Her own routine became a meditation. Each morning, she rose before dawn to make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, then moved through the house with practiced efficiency. She learned to read the subtle signs of his moods, how he arranged his coffee cup on the saucer when troubled, the way he folded his newspaper when content. The town watched her with curious eyes. At the market, conversations paused when she approached, resuming in hushed tones after she passed. She was the stranger, the woman who cleaned the sheriff's house, invisible yet somehow significant. Mrs. Henderson from the employment agency nodded approvingly when they crossed paths. "Settling in well, I hope?" "Yes, ma'am." Maria's answers remained simple, offering nothing that might invite deeper inquiry. In the evenings, she sat by her bedroom window, watching the town settle into darkness. Street lamps bloomed like mechanical flowers, casting pools of yellow light on empty sidewalks. Sometimes she saw Sheriff Carter's patrol car moving slowly through the streets, its headlights sweeping across houses, where families gathered around dinner tables, where children did homework and parents shared the day's small victories and defeats. She had left behind a different life, one where her name had been spoken with suspicion, where neighbors crossed themselves when she passed. Here, she was simply Maria, the quiet woman who tended someone else's life with gentle hands. The anonymity felt like a gift she didn't deserve. But at night, when the house grew quiet and shadows lengthened across the walls, she sometimes heard footsteps overhead, pacing the length of the upstairs study. Back and forth, like a man walking the perimeter of his own conscience. The day Maria found the photograph, autumn had painted the maple trees in shades of fire. She was cleaning the living room mantelpiece, carefully lifting each framed picture to dust beneath, when her cloth caught the corner of one frame and sent it tumbling to the floor. The glass didn't break, but the impact jarred the backing loose, revealing another photograph hidden behind the displayed one. Maria's breath caught in her throat. The hidden image showed Sheriff Carter, younger by perhaps 10 years, standing beside a woman with dark hair and laughing eyes. His arm encircled her waist with casual intimacy, and his expression, so different from the carefully controlled man she knew, radiated genuine joy. The woman wore a simple blue dress and a pendant necklace that caught the camera's flash like captured starlight. Her smile was the kind that lit entire rooms, transforming ordinary moments into memories worth keeping. But someone had taken red ink, or something that looked like red ink, and drawn jagged lines across her face, obscuring her features with violent strokes. Maria's hands shook as she studied the damaged photograph. The red marks looked deliberate, angry, as if whoever had made them wanted to erase the woman entirely. She glanced toward the kitchen, listening for Sheriff Carter's footsteps, but heard only the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Carefully, she repositioned the frame, hiding the damaged photograph behind the approved one, a formal portrait of Sheriff Carter in his dress uniform, solemn and composed. But the image of the laughing woman burned in her memory like an afterimage, haunting and beautiful despite the violent marks that scarred it. That evening, as Maria prepared dinner, she found herself studying Sheriff Carter's face more intently. Had those pale eyes once held warmth? Had that controlled mouth ever curved in unguarded laughter? The evidence of hidden emotion made him seem suddenly, startlingly human. "Is everything all right?" he asked, noticing her distraction. "Yes. Sir, just tired." Maria served his plate with steady hands, but her mind churned with questions she couldn't ask. Who was the woman in the photograph? What had happened to her? And why had someone tried so desperately to erase her from memory? As she washed dishes, Maria's grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Some secrets are buried for good reasons, Mija, but some are buried because the truth is too beautiful to bear." The pendant necklace from the photograph lingered in her thoughts. Delicate silver chain, small charm that might have been a bird or a flower. She had seen something similar before, but couldn't place where. The memory fluttered at the edges of her consciousness like a moth against window glass, elusive and persistent. Upstairs, the pacing began again, footsteps wearing grooves in the floor of the forbidden study. Maria had been polishing the upstairs banister when she heard it, a sound like paper rustling, coming from behind the locked study door. She paused, cloth suspended in mid-air, listening. The house often made mysterious sounds, settling into itself with small groans and whispers, but this was different. deliberate. Sheriff Carter had left for his shift 20 minutes ago. She had watched from the kitchen window as his patrol car disappeared around the corner, taking with it the careful tension that always accompanied his presence. The house felt different when he was gone, not just empty, but somehow able to breathe more freely. The sound came again. Definitely paper, maybe books falling from a shelf, or files being disturbed by the old heating system's unpredictable gusts. Maria approached the study door, her bare feet silent on the worn carpet runner. The brass doorknob felt cold beneath her palm, immovable as expected, but the keyhole drew her attention. Kneeling, she pressed her eye to the small opening, feeling like a child peeking through keyholes at forbidden adult mysteries. The view was limited, a slice of the room that revealed dark wood furniture, towers of file boxes, and something that made her breath catch. A wedding dress. Ivory silk hung on a dressmaker's form in the corner, preserved in protective plastic like a museum piece. The fabric seemed to glow in the dim light, filtering through heavy curtains, ethereal and haunting. Beneath the dress form, a small table held various objects, photographs, jewelry, what looked like letters tied with ribbon. The rustling sound came again, and Maria realized with a start that she could see the source, papers scattered across. The desk were moving in a breeze from somewhere. A window left slightly open, perhaps, or a heating vent. But as her eye adjusted to the dim interior, she noticed something else that made her heart race. The desk held an open book, a journal or diary, its pages fluttering in the mysterious breeze. Even from her limited viewpoint through the keyhole, she could see dark stains on the visible pages. Not blood, as her first fearful thought suggested, but something else. Wine, perhaps, or ink that had been spilled in moments of strong emotion. Maria pulled back from the keyhole, her heart hammering against her ribs. The wedding dress, the diary, the carefully preserved objects, they painted a picture of loss, of someone trying to hold on to memories that time insisted on taking away. This wasn't the room of a criminal or a man with dark secrets. This was the shrine of someone who had loved deeply and lost everything. She stood slowly, her knees aching from kneeling on the hard floor. The locked study suddenly seemed less like a forbidden chamber and more like a wounded heart that couldn't bear to heal. Understanding began to bloom in her chest, tender and painful as a new bruise. Downstairs she returned to her work, but her movements felt different now. Each time she dusted a surface or arranged an object, she imagined the woman in the hidden photograph moving through these same rooms, her laughter echoing in spaces now filled only with careful silence. The storm arrived on a Thursday evening, bringing with it winds that made the house shudder and groan like a ship at sea. Maria was preparing Sheriff Carter's dinner when the lights flickered, casting wild shadows across the kitchen walls. She set down her knife and moved to the window, watching as rain lashed against the glass in sheets so thick they turned the world outside into an impressionist painting. Sheriff Carter arrived home soaked to the bone, his uniform clinging to his frame, hair plastered against his forehead. For the first time since Maria had known him, his careful composure had cracked. He stood in the entryway, dripping onto the hardwood floor, looking lost. "Sir," Maria said gently, approaching with a clean towel, "you'll catch your death." He looked at her, as if surprised to find her there, as if he had forgotten he wasn't alone in the world. When she offered the towel, their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt the cold that had settled into his skin like winter, never fully thawed. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried more weight than usual, as if gratitude was something he had forgotten how to express. Maria watched him climb the stairs, noting how his shoulders curved inward, how his footsteps lacked their usual confident rhythm. The storm had stripped away some essential layer of protection, leaving him raw and human. She understood that feeling, the way grief could catch you unprepared, washing over you like cold rain when you thought you had learned to stay dry. She finished preparing dinner, adding extra portions in case he needed comfort food, then sat by the kitchen window to wait. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, bending trees nearly horizontal and sending debris skittering across the yard like frightened animals. The house felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had drawn closer for warmth. Maria thought about the wedding dress upstairs, preserved in its plastic shroud, and wondered what memories Sheriff Carter was reliving in his locked sanctuary. Did storms remind him of a particular night, a particular loss? When he finally came downstairs, his hair was dry, but his eyes held a distance that had nothing to do with physical space. He sat at the kitchen table without speaking, and Maria served his dinner with hands that had learned to be gentle with broken things. "The storm will pass," she said quietly, filling his coffee cup. He looked up at her then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. "Yes," he said, "it always does." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind howl around the house like a living thing desperate for shelter. Maria understood that some storms were external, rain and wind and lightning that eventually moved on. But others lived inside, eternal weather systems that no amount of waiting could calm. When she cleared his plate, she noticed he had eaten everything, and the tight lines around his eyes had softened slightly. Small victories, her grandmother would have called them. Evidence that healing was always possible, even when it seemed impossible to imagine. The key appeared on a Tuesday morning, placed deliberately beside Maria's coffee cup like an offering. Sheriff Carter had already left for work, but the small brass object gleamed on the kitchen table where he took his morning coffee, impossible to miss. No note accompanied it, no explanation, just the key and the weight of unspoken permission. Maria stared at it for a long time, understanding the significance of the gesture. Trust was not something Sheriff Carter dispensed lightly, she had learned. Every interaction, every word, every expression had been carefully measured and controlled. This key represented a crossing of boundaries, an invitation into the most private chambers of his grief. Her hand trembled as she picked it up, feeling its weight. So small an object to carry such enormous meaning. She had been granted access to the locked study, to the wedding dress and the stained diary, and whatever other relics of love and loss waited behind that closed door. But with the privilege came responsibility, the burden of bearing witness to someone else's most private pain. The walk upstairs felt longer than usual, each step deliberate as a prayer. The key turned smoothly, in the lock, as if it had been waiting all along for her gentle hands. The door opened with a whisper, revealing the room in full for the first time. It was a shrine to memory, carefully curated and lovingly maintained. The wedding dress dominated one corner, ivory silk that seemed to glow with inner light. Nearby, a vanity table held jewelry boxes and perfume bottles, their surfaces dusty, but arranged with reverent precision. Photographs covered every available surface. The same woman from the hidden picture, but alive here in dozens of moments, laughing at a picnic, dancing at what might have been their wedding, reading a book in a garden somewhere, her face turned towards sunlight like a flower. The desk commanded the center of the room, and Maria approached it with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching an altar. The diary lay open, its pages yellowed with age and marked with dark stains that she now recognized as tears, not blood. The handwriting was feminine, flowing, filled with the eager optimism of someone who believed in happy endings. October 15th. He brought me wildflowers today, picked from the meadow behind his mother's house. Silly man, he said they weren't. Proper flowers since they didn't come from a store, but they smelled like sunshine and freedom. I pressed one between these pages so I'll never forget. Maria's throat tightened as she read. This wasn't the diary of a victim or someone who had met a terrible fate. This was the record of a love story, written in the eager hand of a woman who had believed in forever. She turned pages carefully, reading about picnics and shared dreams, about a proposal beneath a harvest moon and wedding plans that filled page after page with excited details. And then, abruptly, the entries stopped. The final page bore only a few lines, the handwriting shakier, different. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do. I'm not afraid of what comes next, but I'm afraid of leaving him alone. He's forgotten how to be happy without me. Maria closed the diary with trembling hands, understanding finally flooding through her like cold water. There had been no crime, no dark secret, no woman who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. There had only been love and loss, and a man who had locked away his grief so completely that it had become a separate room in his life, sealed. hand-preserved like the wedding dress that would never be worn again. The days following Maria's discovery of the truth moved differently, as if time itself had shifted into a more thoughtful rhythm. She went about her duties with new purpose, seeing Sheriff Carter not as an enigmatic employer, but as a fellow traveler, on grief's difficult road. Every carefully pressed uniform, every perfectly prepared meal, every surface polished to gleaming became an act of quiet compassion. She began to notice things she had missed before, the way his fingers lingered on his wedding ring during breakfast, how his eyes sought the empty chair across from him when he thought no one was watching. The house itself seemed different now, that she understood its history. The careful order he maintained wasn't about control, it was about preservation, keeping everything exactly as it had been when love lived here. One morning, Maria found Sheriff Carter standing at the kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching sparrows build a nest in the maple tree. His expression held a softness she had never seen before, as if the small domestic drama outside had touched something he thought he had buried. "They return every spring," he said without turning around. "Same tree, almost the same spot. She used to say they were optimists, building homes that might not survive the winter." It was the first time he had mentioned her directly, the first crack in the careful wall he had built around his memories. Maria felt the weight of the moment, understanding that she was being offered something precious and fragile. "Perhaps they know something we don't," Maria replied gently, joining him at the window, "about the value of trying again." He glanced at her then, and she saw recognition in his eyes, the look of someone who had found an unexpected ally in an unexpected place. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sparrows weave grass and twigs into something that might become home. That afternoon, Maria climbed the stairs to the study with different purpose. She had been granted access, but she had also been granted something more valuable, the understanding that this room needed tending, not intrusion. She began to dust the surfaces with reverent care, treating each photograph like a prayer, each preserved object like a sacred relic. The wedding dress received special attention. Maria had learned to care for delicate fabrics during her years of service, and she could see that the ivory silk needed more than preservation. It needed love. She carefully removed the plastic covering and began the patient work of airing and refreshing the dress, treating it as she would a living thing that had simply been sleeping too long. As she worked, she hummed softly, old lullabies her grandmother had sung, melodies that carried comfort across languages and generations. The music seemed to bring warmth to the room, making it feel less like a mausoleum and more like a place where love was honored, where memory could coexist with hope. When Sheriff Carter came home that evening, he paused at the base of the stairs, head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. The house felt different, not emptier or fuller, but somehow more alive, as if something that had been holding its breath had finally begun to breathe again. The transformation began with small things, gestures so subtle they might have passed unnoticed by anyone not looking for signs of thaw. Sheriff Carter began leaving his coffee cup in different places, not randomly but with the careful precision of someone testing new possibilities. Sometimes on the kitchen counter instead of the table, sometimes by the living room window, where morning light turned the ceramic white as fresh snow. Maria responded to these changes with her own quiet experiments. She placed a single wildflower, picked from the garden behind the house, in a small vase beside his evening meal. Nothing dramatic, nothing that demanded acknowledgement, just a small splash of color that said, "Beauty is still possible." He said nothing about the flower, but the next morning, Maria found it had been moved to the windowsill in the study, placed carefully beside a photograph of his wife in a summer garden. The gesture spoke volumes about acceptance, about the delicate work of allowing new beauty to coexist with preserved memory. Their conversations, while still brief, began to carry different undertones. When Sheriff Carter mentioned the weather, Maria heard him really talking about the changing seasons, about time's passage and the possibility of renewal. When she commented on the mail or the daily newspapers, she was really acknowledging the world beyond grief, the life that continued to unfold outside their careful sanctuary. One evening, Maria was preparing to leave a plate of cookies on the kitchen counter when Sheriff Carter entered unexpectedly. Instead of retreating to his study as usual, he paused, studying the simple offering with the intensity of someone trying to remember a foreign language. "My grandmother's recipe," Maria said quietly, "meant for sharing." He took one, chewing thoughtfully, and for a moment his expression shifted into something that might have been the shadow of a smile. "Clara made cookies," he said finally. "Terrible ones. Burned every batch, but she kept trying because she said the kitchen smelled like happiness when she baked." It was the most personal thing he had ever shared, the first time he had spoken his wife's name aloud in Maria's presence. The word, Clara, hung in the air like a small benediction, transforming the kitchen into a place where memories could be spoken without breaking. "The trying matters more than the success," Maria replied, and she saw him understand that she was talking about more than cookies, more than baking, more than any single act of domestic hope. That night, as Maria prepared for bed, she heard different sounds from the study above. Not the restless pacing she had grown accustomed to, but the gentle rustle of pages being turned, as if someone were reading stories instead of wearing grooves in the floor with endless circles of grief. The house itself seemed to be learning how to hold two kinds of love at once, the preserved love for what was lost and the growing love for what remained possible. Maria understood that she was witnessing something rare and precious, the careful work of a heart learning to beat again, not forgetting its previous rhythm, but discovering new songs it might still sing. The first sign of external resistance came in the form of Mrs. Henderson's unexpected visit on a grey October morning. Maria was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sharp rap of knuckles against the front door, followed by the distinctive voice that had first hired her. "I need to speak with you about your situation." Through the kitchen window, Maria watched Mrs. Henderson's severe figure, all sharp angles and disapproving lines, as Sheriff Carter welcomed her into the living room. Their voices carried clearly through the thin walls, and Maria found herself frozen between the clothesline and the house, caught in the uncomfortable position of unwitting eavesdropper. "The town is talking, Carter. You can't be blind to it." "What exactly are they saying?" Sheriff Carter's voice carried its usual controlled tone, but Maria detected something new underneath, a warning note like distant thunder. "That woman has been here nearly 2 months. Alone in your house day after day, people notice things. They remember Clara, they remember how proper things used to be. This arrangement, it doesn't look right." Maria felt heat rise in her cheeks, understanding suddenly that her quiet presence had become a source of speculation and judgment. In her previous life, before she had fled to this small town seeking anonymity, she had endured similar whispers, similar disapproval. The familiar shame began to unfurl in her chest like a dark flower. "Maria Santos is my employee," Sheriff Carter said, and the deliberate use of her full name felt like a shield. "She maintains my household with discretion and professionalism. I fail to see how that concerns anyone else." "Oh, Carter." Mrs. Henderson's voice carried the particular condescension reserved for men who were thought to be naive about women's machinations. "You can't possibly be that innocent. A young woman alone taking care of a widower's most intimate needs, Mrs. Henderson." The voice that interrupted carried such authority that Maria felt it in her bones. This was the voice Sheriff Carter used for dangerous situations, for moments when order had to be restored immediately. "I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." The silence that followed stretched like a wire about to snap. Maria pressed her back against the kitchen wall, heart hammering, understanding that this conversation would determine her future in ways she couldn't yet foresee. "I'm only trying to protect your reputation," Mrs. Henderson said finally, her voice smaller but still stubborn. "Clara wouldn't want—" "Don't." The single word cut like a blade. "Don't presume to speak for my wife. And don't presume to judge the woman who has brought more peace to this house than it has known in 2 years." Maria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of Sheriff Carter's defense like a warm cloak around her shoulders. But she also understood the precarious nature of her position, the way small-town judgment could build like a storm, gathering strength until it swept away everything in its path. Mrs. Henderson left without another word, her heels clicking against the front porch like angry punctuation marks. Maria remained pressed against the kitchen wall, listening to the settling silence, knowing that everything had changed. The careful sanctuary they had built together, built of small gestures and growing trust and shared understanding, now faced its first real threat from the outside world. When Sheriff Carter found her in the kitchen an hour later, her hands were shaking as she prepared his lunch. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying her profile with the intensity of someone making important decisions. "Maria," he said finally, and her name in his voice sounded like a promise. "We need to talk." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where they had shared so many careful conversations, but the air between them felt different now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Sheriff Carter's hands rested flat on the worn wooden surface, and Maria noticed how steady they were, how sure, even as her own trembled around her coffee cup. "I won't pretend Mrs. Henderson doesn't represent a significant portion of this town's opinion," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence she had come to associate with his most serious moments. "Small places have long memories and strong opinions about what constitutes proper behavior." Maria nodded, understanding flooding through her. She had lived this story before in different places, with different details, but the same ending: the outsider, the woman who disrupted carefully established order simply by existing. "I should go," she said quietly. "I should have expected this." "Should you?" He leaned forward slightly, and she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before, not just kindness but fierce protectiveness. "Should you have expected to be judged for honest work? For bringing light back into a house that had forgotten what warmth felt like?" The words hung between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. Maria had spent so long believing herself to be the problem, the disruption, the woman who brought trouble simply by breathing the same air as respectable people. To hear herself described as someone who brought light, it was almost too much to accept. "Clara loved this house," Sheriff Carter continued, his voice growing softer, "but she would have hated what it became after she died. A museum, a shrine, a place where I was slowly turning into a ghost myself. You changed that, not by forgetting her, but by helping me remember that love doesn't have to end with death. It can transform into something else, something that honors what was while still allowing for what might be." Maria felt tears gathering in her eyes, understanding that he was offering her something precious, not just employment, not just shelter, but genuine recognition of her worth. In her old life, before the accusations and the whispers and the long flight to this small town, she had forgotten that such recognition was possible. "But the town," she began. "The town will adjust," he said with quiet certainty. "People respect strength, even when they disagree with its application. And Maria," he paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully, "I'm not just asking you to stay as my employee, I'm asking you to stay as my friend, as someone who has helped me find my way back to the land of the living." The word friend settled between them like a small miracle. Not employer and employee, not the powerful and the powerless, but two people who had found in each other something unexpected and valuable. Maria thought of the wedding dress she had carefully tended, of the diary she had read with reverent hands, of the photographs she had dusted like prayers. She thought of the small wildflowers and the shared cookies and the growing ease of their conversations. "I would like that," she said finally, and the words felt like the first honest thing she had said in months. Sheriff Carter smiled then, not the careful, controlled expression she was accustomed to, but something genuine and warm that transformed his entire face. For a moment, she could see the young man from the hidden photograph, the one who had loved so completely that losing it had nearly destroyed him. "Then we understand each other," he said. "Now about Mrs. Henderson and her concerns. I think it's time this town remembered that Sheriff Carter makes his own decisions about his own life." The next weeks passed like pages in a book Maria was finally brave enough to read. Sheriff Carter, who had asked her quietly to call him David when they were alone, began to move through the house with different energy. Not the careful, preserved grief she had grown accustomed to, but something more vital, more present. He still visited the study regularly, still tended to Clara's memory with reverent hands, but now he also sat in other rooms, reclaimed other spaces, allowed the house to serve the living as well as the dead. Maria found herself changing too, small transformations that accumulated like snow, each one barely noticeable until the landscape had become entirely different. She began to hum while she worked, filling the house with music it hadn't heard in years. She rearranged furniture subtly, creating conversation areas and reading nooks, giving the rooms permission to be lived in instead of merely preserved. The town's resistance manifested in small ways. Conversations that stopped when she passed, pointed glances at the market, the kind of social pressure that felt like trying to breathe underwater. But Maria had survived worse, and now she had something she hadn't possessed before. An ally. Someone who stood with her instead of against her. David's support came in quiet but unmistakable ways. He walked with her to the market on Saturday mornings, his presence at her side a statement that required no words. He mentioned her name in casual conversations with other town officials, normalizing her existence, making her part of the fabric of his public life. Most importantly, he treated her with consistent respect and kindness, providing a model for how others might behave. One afternoon, while cleaning the living room, Maria discovered that David had made changes of his own. New photographs had appeared among the old ones, pictures of the town's recent harvest festival, of neighbors and friends, of life continuing to unfold in the present tense. Clara's photographs remained, but they had been joined by evidence that time moved forward, that love could expand rather than simply preserve. "I hope you don't mind," David said, finding her studying the new arrangements. "I thought it was time to let the house remember that it's still alive." Maria touched the frame of one new photograph, a picture of the sparrows that had built their nest in the maple tree, surrounded by tiny fledglings that had somehow survived the winter. "She would have liked this," Maria said, meaning Clara, meaning the evidence of hope continuing. "Yes," David agreed, "she would have." That evening, Maria made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She had been carrying her grandmother's rosary in her pocket for weeks, the wooden beads worn smooth by generations of prayers, and now she placed it carefully on the kitchen windowsill beside the small vase that held fresh flowers. It was her own small declaration of presence, her way of saying, "Kai, I belong here too." When David noticed it the next morning, he studied the rosary with the same careful attention he gave to all meaningful objects. "Your grandmother's?" he asked. "Yes. She always said prayers had more power when they had good places to rest." David nodded, understanding completely. "Then it's exactly where it should be." The house felt different now, no longer preserved in amber but alive and breathing, and capable of holding multiple stories at once. Clara's love remained, honored and remembered, but it had made room for other forms of affection, friendship, companionship, the quiet joy of shared daily life. Maria was learning that love was not a finite resource that ran out when shared, but something that multiplied in the presence of willing hearts. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in November, delivered by a nervous postal worker who seemed surprised to be bringing mail addressed to Maria Santos at Sheriff Carter's residence. Maria accepted the envelope with trembling hands, recognizing immediately the careful script of her sister Eleanor, the first contact from her old life since she had fled to this small town seeking refuge from scandal and whispered accusations. David found her standing at the kitchen window, letter unopened, tears streaming down her face like winter rain against glass. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations, simply stood beside her with the patient presence of someone who understood that some storms had to be weathered in silence. "My sister," Maria managed finally, holding up the envelope like evidence of a crime. "I haven't heard from her in 8 months, since the trial." David's expression remained carefully neutral, but Maria saw understanding flicker in his eyes. Bad news travels fast. Good news takes its own time. Maria opened the letter with hands that shook like autumn leaves, and David watched her face change as she read, watched relief bloom across her features like sunrise after the longest night. Querida Maria, the letter began, and the familiar endearment felt like an embrace across impossible distance. The man who accused you has been arrested. The real thief was caught stealing from the church collection, and he confessed to everything. Father Miguel says your name has been cleared completely, that everyone understands now that you were innocent of everything except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maria pressed the letter to her chest, feeling vindication wash over her like clean water. For 8 months, she had carried the weight of false accusations, the shame of being branded a thief and driven from her home by suspicion and gossip. She had rebuilt her life in this small town, believing she would never be able to return to the place where she was born, where her family lived, where her roots ran deep as ancient trees. "You're free," David said softly, understanding without explanation what the letter meant. "Yes." The word came out as barely a whisper. "I can go home." They stood together in silence, the magnitude of her vindication settling between them like a bridge that could carry her back to her old life. But as the initial joy began to settle, Maria found herself thinking not about what she could return to, but about what she would have to leave behind. This house had become home in ways she hadn't expected. These rooms had witnessed her healing, her growth, her transformation from a woman fleeing shame into someone who belonged somewhere, who mattered to someone, who had found purpose and peace in the simple act of caring for another person's life. David had become more than an employer, more than a friend. He had become family, chosen and cherished. "Elena wants me to come home for Christmas," Maria said, her voice carrying uncertainty despite the joy of vindication. "She says everyone is asking about me, wanting to make amends." David nodded, but she saw something flicker across his expression, not selfishness or possessiveness, but the quiet sadness of someone preparing to say goodbye to something precious. "You should go," he said with characteristic generosity. "You should see your family, let them see who you've become. Let them know that their Maria not only survived but thrived." But even as he spoke the words, both of them understood that this moment represented more than just a choice between two places. It was a choice between two versions of herself, the woman she had been before the accusations, and the woman she had become in the careful sanctuary of this house, in the presence of someone who had seen her clearly and chosen to trust her completely. "I don't know what I want anymore," Maria admitted. "Then you have time to decide," David replied. "Good things wait." The days leading to her decision passed like prayers, slow, contemplative, weighted with the kind of significance that transforms ordinary moments into memories. Maria moved through her routines with heightened awareness, as if she were experiencing everything for the first time, or perhaps the last time. Each surface she cleaned, each meal she prepared, each comfortable silence she shared with David, felt precious and fragile. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The autumn light that filtered through the windows carried a different quality, golden and nostalgic, as if even the sun understood that something was ending or beginning or transforming into something entirely new. David gave her space to think, but his presence remained constant, not pressuring, not pleading, simply being himself, with the kind of steady reliability that had become one of her life's great comforts. He began to make small preparations for her potential departure, ensuring her references were impeccable, setting aside money for travel expenses, treating her decision with the respect of someone who understood that love sometimes meant letting go. One evening, as Maria prepared what might be her last dinner in this kitchen, she found herself studying David's face with new intensity. The careful control he had maintained when she first arrived had given way to something more open, more human. He laughed now, smiled easily, spoke Clara's name without the weight of unbearable grief. He had healed, not by forgetting his wife, but by learning to carry her memory like a blessing instead of a burden. "You did that," he said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "You helped me find my way back to the living." "We did it together," Maria corrected. "You helped me remember who I could be when someone believed in me." They sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of unspoken possibilities settling around them like twilight. Maria thought about Elena's letter, about the family waiting for her return, about the life she could reclaim now that her name had been cleared. But she also thought about the life she had built here, about the man who had become her dearest friend, about the house that had learned to breathe again because they had given it permission. "I have something for you," David said finally, rising from the table. He disappeared into the study and returned carrying a small jewelry box, the kind that might hold earrings or a delicate necklace. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, lay a pendant on a silver chain, a small bird in flight, its wings spread wide as if caught in the moment of soaring. Maria recognized it immediately from the hidden photograph, from Clara's neck in a dozen preserved images. "I can't," Maria whispered, understanding the magnitude of what he was offering. "Clara would want it worn by someone who understood its meaning," David said gently. "Someone who knew that birds return not because they have to, but because they choose to, because they've found something worth coming back to." Maria lifted the necklace with trembling hands, feeling its weight, not heavy but substantial, like a promise made in silver and intention. The bird seemed to catch the kitchen light, its tiny wings glowing as if alive, as if ready to fly or equally ready to nest. "Will you help me?" she asked, and David moved behind her chair, his hands gentle as he fastened the clasp at the nape of her neck. The pendant settled against her heart like a blessing, like a choice made manifest. When she turned to face him, David was smiling with the kind of joy that transforms ordinary moments into miracles. "Now," he said, "about Christmas. I was thinking we might have your sister here instead of sending you away. This house has been too quiet for too long. It's time it remembered how to hold celebrations." Maria felt her decision settle into place, like a bird finally choosing its perch. She touched the pendant at her throat, feeling its promise of flight and return, of choices made not from fear, but from love. "Yes," she said, and the word carried the weight of commitment, of choosing, to build rather than flee, of trusting in the possibility of home being something you create rather than something you're born into. Christmas morning arrived dressed in snow, each flake falling like a blessing onto the transformed landscape of their shared life. Maria woke before dawn, not from anxiety or obligation, but from the deep contentment of someone who had found exactly where she belonged. The house hummed with anticipation. Eleanor would arrive in the afternoon, bringing with her stories of vindication and family love, but also witnessing the new life Maria had built from the ashes of false accusations. The kitchen sparkled with preparation. Maria had spent days creating a feast that honored both traditions. Her grandmother's tamales, alongside Clara's recipe for honey-glazed ham, discovered in a handwritten cookbook David had brought down from the study like an offering from the past to the present. The whole house smelled of cinnamon and hope, of memories being honored while new ones were carefully crafted. David found her standing at the kitchen window, watching the snow transform the garden into something magical and new. The pendant rested at her throat, catching the early light like a small promise kept. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who had found peace, not the desperate peace of someone hiding from life, but the deep satisfaction of someone who had chosen love over fear, trust over suspicion, hope over resignation. "Eleanor will love the house," David said, joining her at the window. "She'll see what I see." "What do you see?" Maria asked, though she thought she knew. "Someone who came here wounded and chose to heal. Someone who helped a broken man remember how to be whole. Someone who turned a house into a home again." Outside, the sparrows had returned to their nest in the maple tree, proving David's earlier words about the optimism of creatures who understood the value of trying again. Maria watched them flutter among the snow-laden branches, their small bodies dark against the white world, and thought about the various forms love could take, passionate and preserving like David's love for Clara, fierce and protective like her own family's love, gentle and growing like what she and David had built together. Eleanor's arrival brought warmth and laughter, and the rapid Spanish of sisterly affection too long suppressed. She embraced Maria with tears and apologies, with stories of vindication and community shame for doubting someone they had known all their lives. But more importantly, she saw immediately what this new life had given her sister: confidence, purpose, the particular glow of someone who had found where she belonged. "You look different," Elena said as they prepared dinner together, switching effortlessly between English and Spanish as they had since childhood. Not just happy, but settled. Like roots have grown. Maria touched the pendant at her throat, feeling its weight like an anchor that kept her steady. "I never thought I could feel at home anywhere again." "And David?" Eleanor asked, with the directness of sisters who had never learned to dance around important subjects. "David is family," Maria said simply, and Elena smiled with the understanding of someone who recognized love in all its forms. That evening, as they sat around the dining room table that had been set with Clara's good china and Maria's grandmother's silver, David raised his glass in a toast that felt like a benediction. "To the women who have made this house a home," he said, looking first at the photograph of Clara that remained on the mantelpiece, then at Elena, finally at Maria. "To love that transforms rather than diminishes, that builds rather than destroys, that chooses hope over fear." Maria felt tears gather in her eyes, but they were good tears, tears of gratitude rather than grief. She looked around the table. At Eleanor's joyful face, at David's expression of deep contentment, at the house that had learned to hold multiple stories at once, and understood that she had found something rarer than vindication, more valuable than innocence restored. She had found home, not the place where she was born, but the place where she had chosen to grow, to heal, to become the woman she was meant to be. The pendant at her throat caught the candlelight like a small star, and Maria understood that sometimes the greatest courage was not in leaving but in staying, not in fleeing, but in choosing to build something beautiful from the fragments of what had been broken. The snow continued to fall outside, transforming the world into something clean and new, while inside 3 people who had learned to trust in second chances shared a meal that tasted like forgiveness, like possibility, like love in all its unexpected forms. As the evening settled around them like a gentle embrace, Maria touched the pendant one more time and whispered a prayer of gratitude to her grandmother, to Clara, to the mysterious forces that had led her to this table, this house, this life she could never have imagined, but wouldn't trade for any other. The sparrows in the maple tree had built their nest to last through winter, and Maria understood finally that she had done the same, created something that would endure, something that honored the past while embracing the future, something that proved love was always stronger than fear when given the chance to grow.